Now, at this point, I would like to turn it back to Mark, whose second presentation is titled Better Understanding the Supply Chains of Niagara Region Firms. He will also share the results of an in-depth survey conducted in 2019 of the Niagara region businesses. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Justin. Okay, so I'll expect to go through this in about 15 minutes or so as we can move on to our final presentation. So just a quick outline. I'm going to start by highlighting the findings, so sort of do the conclusions first. Some traits of the firms that were in the survey that Blake described, freight movements and their origination. Focus a bit on perceptions about supply chain delays and stresses on the supply chain. Focus on the costs on the supply chain as perceived by participant firms. There's an aspect dealing with outsourcing and its relevance to things like technology adoption, which was kind of interesting. And of course, export and export diversification are significant themes, along with evaluation of potential improvements for the supply chains. Blake's given a pretty good background. I can say that the report is available on the MITL website at this point, and here's the link. So you can read more extensively about the items that are covered in this presentation and a lot of things that we couldn't cover in this presentation just due to time limitations. So we developed an extensive online survey instrument, and the focus was on firms that originate goods. We got 103 complete responses and 98 partial responses, and of course the work was done pre-COVID. And the survey was fairly involved because we were doing a lot of digging. The median completion time was about 30 minutes. So what were some of the main findings? High costs emerged again as something that's perceived as very important, a significant cost of doing business. And also there's a lot of worry about it, at least as it stood at the end of last year. Traffic emerged again as one of the leading concerns, and I guess it's noteworthy for Niagara region that especially GTA traffic was a major concern for those firms, so it was affecting their operations. But to solve traffic congestion, the firms aren't too crazy about pricing types of solutions that, in their view, might increase the cost of doing business. In terms of the international connections of firms, Blake described some of that to some extent, but the data showed that Niagara firms are more internationalized on the sourcing side and a bit less on the revenue side, but there's a lesser difference for manufacturing. With regard to outsourcing, it's a major differentiating variable, basically, that along with e-commerce adoption. And firms that have mastered outsourcing, in many ways, it came through in the results that they appear as being a bit more accomplished than some of their other counterparts. With regard to export diversification, those that have done ED, as it turns out from our results, are more optimistic about it, and they have a higher opinion of what it can do for a firm. So if you've done it and you're good at it, it influences your perceptions about it relative to other firms that haven't. And also, we were dealing with, it became through in the results that we're dealing with human elements in these types of studies. In particular, there was a focus on small and medium enterprises. So these types of firms are prevalent, and they may rely on a few key leaders. So issues like, the ambition of particular leaders in developing and extending supply chains are quite relevant to some of the outcomes that take place. So moving on just into some of the details, I'll try to go through a lot of these quickly. We were mostly dealing with smaller firms here, as you can see by their revenues. E-commerce, about 2/3 of the firms here were not dealing with it at all, and a lot of firms deal with it maybe up to 5 or 10% of sales. Here's a breakdown of some of the sectors that were involved. We've got pretty good representation from crop production and then an assortment of wholesalers and manufacturers. In terms of product lines and suppliers, this is where the connections and the interrelationships and the movements, the freight movements come from ultimately. So we see that a lot of the firms have a pretty large number of product lines, actually. There's a good number that are above 500, for example. If you look at it in terms of product lines that are exported, there's quite a bit of involvement there as well, although there's also, I guess, a decent share, maybe about a third share of the firms that are not exporting any of their product lines. On the input side, with regard to supplier firms, we can see that there's quite a large number of firms that are involved with supplying our Niagara firms in one way or another. So, detailed and extensive interconnections are apparent. So all these connections translate into freight movements, and this chart's associated with the frequency of these freight movements. We've got outbound on the left, we've got inbound on the right, and we've got the modes. And the pictures are more or less similar. You can see that truck is dominant in terms of daily or weekly trips taking place. But we've got a fair amount going on with regard to the other modes. There's a bit more activity on the inbound side apparently relative to the outbound side. Now, we asked our respondents to go through ranking exercises where we give them a list of items, and physically through drag and drop they had to rank the items that they see on the screen based on their importance. So we did this we gave them a set of potential delay types, and we asked them to rank them in terms of importance. So in this case, road congestion associated with the GTHA, the red color indicates a top ranking. So it was ranked first by a large share of people. So red means top rankings, blue means a lot of bottom rankings. And basically what comes to the top is road congestion associated with either the GTHA or Niagara region. But they do seem to be prioritizing the GTHA over Niagara region. And then we do have a fair amount of first place concerns, I guess, with the US-Canada border, which comes in third. And I guess a little bonus figure down here shows that about half of the firms expect to spend more than 30 minutes to cross the Canada-US border. So these two things are sort of interrelated. And then some of these other items, bear in mind, of course, that some of these are not so frequently used compared to the trucking mode, certainly. But there is this subset of firms that are very, very focused on what's going on with rail. And that is a fairly prominent result. So again, a similar type of ranking exercise with 7 items being ranked. And in this case, we're focusing on stresses on the supply chain. So we proposed a series of stresses and the respondents ranked them. So what comes to the top of the list is supply chain costs are expensive and on the rise. You see a lot of red. There are far too many restrictive regulations and too much red tape, lots of red. If we move down to some of the items at the bottom, and of course you'll get the chance to review some of these in more detail later, we see things like there's a lack of redundancy in the regional transport system, so not too much red there at all. That's sort of interesting from the point of view that the Mid-Peninsula Highway, which a lot of people are arguing for, I guess one of the arguments for it has to do with providing extra redundancy. Supply chain lacks visibility. We lose track of goods. So this shows up as very much as a lower ranked item. So moving on to some of the costs that are in the supply chain, we've already established that people are pretty concerned about them. So this gives some idea of how the numbers break out basically as a percentage of revenues. So we've got agricultural firms, manufacturing firms, and wholesaling firms, and we've got these main classes of items. So we can see that for transportation costs, it's sort of in and around 6% of revenues. I guess the other most noteworthy result relates to inventory carrying in the gray, where we can see that as we go from agricultural over to wholesaling, the costs are much more significant for wholesaling. And when we add these items together for each one, we end up with these totals as average logistics costs as a percentage of revenue. So we're at about 10% for agricultural firms, about 12% for manufacturing firms, and about 15% for wholesaling firms. I should add that these results are updated slightly from an earlier version of the report. And here we focus particularly on transportation expenditures, and basically people are emphasizing expenditures on trucking, including in some cases the operation of their own fleets. Now, with regard to outsourcing, and essentially we're talking about third-party logistics, 3PLs, we have this result that there's about a third of the firms that aren't using a 3PL in any way. And then there's quite a few that are using 3PL minimally or moderately, and a few where it's quite important. Here we have them assess the importance of a series of items associated with benefits of a 3PL. So we can see that things like reducing transportation costs, perhaps not surprisingly, ranks close to the top, better service for customers, and so forth. Some of these are at the bottom, or perhaps less appreciated by some people, or maybe not so well understood. We found that there was a link between outsourcing and views on technology, and our colleague Dr. Amir Amiri has been doing a multivariate analysis on this. It's on Niagara data, and it shows that appreciation of 3PL value added is linked positively to openness to emerging autonomous technologies. So basically what this is saying is that in some cases, adoption of autonomous technologies to some extent is likely to take place via outsourcing, in the sense that if you use a 3PL and a 3PL uses a carrier, it may be the carrier ultimately that chooses to adopt the autonomous technology. So that was sort of interesting. And then another little bonus figure here: in what time period will it become commonplace for your goods to be moved in fully automated driverless vehicles? Well, about half the sample says it will never become commonplace. So we found that to be a very interesting result. And of course, there's the optimists over here. So moving on to geographical issues and exporting and so forth. So geographical patterns of revenues and input expenditures. So on the left, we have where outputs go. And on the right, we have where inputs come from. So basically, I guess these are the regions involved, or the geographies: Niagara region, rest of Ontario, other provinces, United States, and other international. So the more bright red and pink you're seeing, the more international things are getting. So we can see that we're a bit more internationalized on the input side than we are on the output side. And this is export diversification here beyond the US. And there's some really large differences for wholesaling and also for agriculture. And the percentage difference is somewhat less for manufacturing. This just shows how the top ranked countries for exporting from the viewpoints of the firms that were doing the exporting or the importing. So it's a pretty simple pattern in terms of top ranking. So 80% of the firms are saying that their top ranked exporting partner is in the US, 10% are saying it's China, and then we have an assortment for the other 10%. The picture is a bit more nuanced on the import side, where we've got about 63% for the United States, 15% for China, and then a whole array of countries that are involved. So a bit more nuance on the importing side of things in terms of being, the top ranked country for each firm. The final of our 3 ranking exercises that I'm going to talk about, again, we gave them the 7 items, and we said, rank the challenges to exporting beyond the United States. So essentially, what are the challenges to export diversification? Regulatory impediments is at the top of the list, and perhaps surprisingly, large travel distances, being as we're potentially dealing with ongoing overseas travel and so forth. I mean, it's a particularly large impediment nowadays, but even before that, it was viewed somewhat negatively by a lot of these small and medium enterprises. So this is an interesting result. Tariffs and quotas, I guess, are in some ways related to regulatory. Just to look at some of the things at the bottom, culture or language differences didn't rank very highly, which maybe I found a bit surprising, as well as the protection of intellectual property, which didn't register very much for a top ranking at all. Another interesting question is, well, to what extent are Niagara firms essentially excited about the potential for export diversification? So essentially, we gave them a 1 to 10 scale, and we said, choose your number between 1 and 10, where 1 means they're essentially seeing no potential on the horizon, and 10 means they're seeing massive potential and opportunity. So basically, what we're seeing here is that there's a lot more optimism amongst the manufacturers than there is amongst wholesaling and agricultural primary. Amongst wholesaling, we're not even seeing any 10 scores, so the highest scores are reserved for these two categories. So this is sort of an interesting result. There's a few aspects here about how firms that are currently export diversified already, how they might differ from some of the other firms. So the items are basically, we've seen that they do more outsourcing, they're less likely to operate their own private fleets. They've got some viewpoints that are a bit less parochial perhaps, and that's based on sort of the review of quite a few results. More diversified use of modes, and in general, there seems to be this sense of a bit more optimism amongst those that are currently export diversified. So this is the final slide here, and it's an assessment of potential supply chain related improvements within Niagara region. I guess some of the items are beyond Niagara region. So these items arose from a process that we went through last year. We thought it made sense to give these to the surveyed people and see how they responded to the items. So we can see that Highway 401 congestion in Toronto is coming out as the most important item for Niagara region firms, and also Highway 407 is very much a Toronto related item. And then also ranking highly is the Mid-Peninsula Highway. And near the top, there's support for funding to support planning. If we go down to the bottom, not too much interest in the potential benefits of metropolitan rapid transit. Maybe this would differ in a Toronto survey. Not too much interest in congestion pricing as a way to solve congestion, and not too much concern about industrial and warehouse space. So with that, I'll conclude and I'll pass it on to Justin.
Oh, thank you, Mark. Thank you for that presentation. Certainly a lot of great information buried in the details, and it sort of sets us up for more work in this area. So thank you for that.